Global Impact Forum. Our discussion today is on the future of urban mobility and innovation in transport. And we have a great panel for you. We have Rikesh Shah, who's the head of commercial innovation for Transport for London. Robin Chase, who's co-founder of Zipcar and also New Urban Mobility Alliance. Mark Thomas, who's the vice president of marketing and alliances at Ridecell. And Karen Vancluysen, who's Secretary General at POLIS. I'm going to start with a question that Robin posed, which I think is very important for us at this critical juncture we're at right now, as electric vehicles are starting to make a headway in the marketplace, but still are a small part of the whole picture. And also, we still have the public transit system reeling from the effects of COVID, and we're recovering from all that. So assuming we continue on a straightforward path of recovery from all of this, where would you like to see us in 5 years? Robin, let's start with you on that since you posed the question.
I think that, we've spent the last 100 years becoming a car-dominated planet, and it hasn't served us well for a number of reasons. So I would love to see us in 5 years to have addressed the plight of single occupancy vehicles and to become a multimodal urban society where we choose the mode that fits the trip. And we will have reduced congestion, increased access, reduced cost to individuals and households. And that's what I'd love to see us come out as.
And in thinking about this question, of course, we have to think about autonomous vehicles and whether that's actually going to even happen in 5 years. I think the timetable for that was extremely ambitious. I think it's run into a lot of technical issues now, and whether it'll even happen in 5 years is unclear. Karen, where do you think we will be in 5 years, and where would you like to see us be?
Well, I hope we will finally move to cities for people rather than cities for cars. So very much aligned with what Robin was saying, and the respacing that we've seen happening during the pandemic in favor of active travel and away from all that predominant space for private cars. We hope that this will be further accelerated, and that also those permanent interventions temporary interventions will become permanent over time. At the same time, as you said, mass transit was hit hard. So we also need to work actively towards its recovery. And we really need all those sustainable modes to join forces and together compete with this monomodal attraction of the private car. Picking up on your point on autonomous vehicles, I think there has been a strong optimism bias from the private sector, from the companies for a long time, but now we see that it's not going to happen tomorrow. Also, we have to recognize that the urban environment is inherently more complex than the highway environment, for example, when it comes to rolling out automation. And the warning I would like to issue in that respect is also that cities have to think today about what will be arriving tomorrow and really set the rules of the game in terms of the use cases they see for automation, not just open their city doors to automated cars in the way they did to the conventional car, because then it's not going to solve issues. But if we really identify in which cases it can add value, then I see a positive future for the autonomous car.
Can I throw in one point there, since Karen just opened it up quickly? So several years ago, or 3 years ago, I worked with a number of large city and transportation NGOs, and we created the shared mobility principles. And principle number 10 out of 10 is that autonomous vehicles in dense urban areas must be electric and shared. Again, trying to get away from the idea that you can actually have private car ownership in cities and private driverless car ownership, which would be worse yet.
Exactly.
I think it's important that we address that. I still don't see that we really are addressing it. I mean, the autonomous car has been pushed back, but really sort of contemplating how we're going to adopt them is still, to me, still out there as a question. Rikesh, I want to move on to you, and your agency, Transport for London, has done a lot to identify one of the things that both Karen and Robin mentioned, which is making our cities more for people than for cars. London inaugurated a very innovative congestion charge, which seems very expensive to us here in America. I think it's $18. It would be $18. It's like what is it, 12 pounds, something like that. And I'm curious, and you also have in London a what's called a ultra low emission zone. And so let me first ask you, before we get to the future thing, how those two things are working. And I know other cities have copied it. I think Stockholm, others.
Sure, Jim, thank you. So I think firstly, it's about what strategic outcome you want for a city, and then you align the interventions against that. And in our case, by 2041, we want 80% of trips to be made by walking, cycling, or public transit. So if you're going to move people away...
What percentage is it now, Rikesh?
So just before the pandemic, it was around 63%. So it's still a significant shift. But there's millions of people that are using public transport and active forms of transport every day. But what we need to make sure is that alternative is there. So a good public transport provision is part of our sort of strategic purpose, and also to provide the right opportunities to be active in our city. So having the right walkways, the right cycleways. So I think having that alternative, and in London, you're no more than 400 yards from a public transport point, whether it's a bus, tube, or other form of transport. So I think getting that right is really important. What we've seen with congestion pricing, whether it's a congestion charge initially in 2003 or with the ULEZ that we have now, is the air is cleaning up and we're seeing less congestion. So, but you've got to provide the right alternative at the right for everyone.
Faced with that kind of charge, do you have an idea of what percentage of drivers are discouraged from driving into the city every day?
Well, it's also about changing the car. So what we're trying to do is get the most polluting vehicles of the road network. So it's about reducing the bad polluting cars in our city. In terms of exact percentage, I don't have it to hand, I'm afraid.
I think if you got to 80% of those people using alternative forms of transit, there'd be very few cities in the US that could match that. Maybe New York City, possibly, but other than that, Boston, I don't know, maybe. I don't think so, but that's certainly Europe is ahead of the US in terms of adopting public transit. Mark, on to you. 5 years. What do you see? Where would you like to be with Ridecell?
It's interesting. 5 years from now, 5 years ago, I think we all thought we'd be riding around in autonomous Uber. The moving over from ownership to, and that clearly hasn't happened. It's a much more difficult experience. And so what we're seeing that's really taking off, though, is electrification. And so the wave of having all the delivery vehicles be electric, having these things become more digitalized, turning them into fleets that are less about one vehicle, one driver, and having more electric vehicles out there. And it's not just electric vans or electric passenger cars, but the whole movement to electric bicycles now is a game changer, because electric bicycles are actually vehicle replacements if you have reasonable weather. Even in a hilly city like San Francisco, it's very, very much a substitute. For $88 a month, you can get a Van Moof, so that it's priced more like transportation rather than having to spend, $4,000 or $5,000 to get the bike. So it's just working into people's lives in a much better way than in the past, when it really was, as people have said, the tyranny of the private vehicle ownership. The birthright of having street parking, seeing these spots dissipate and turn into parklets for restaurants, and having mobility lanes that are protected from vehicles by moving the parked cars that are parked, into the road, and letting the cyclists and the people on kick scooters use the mobility lanes now.
I was just in Austin, Texas, and I was amazed that the scooters are just about everywhere. And Rikesh mentioned you're never in London very far from some form of public transit. in Austin, you're never far from a scooter. If you want an electric scooter, there's going to be one leaning against the building you're going into. It's amazing that way. And it seemed innovative to me, though other people might see it as littering. I found it I found it interesting.
One thing that Mark said that I'd like to comment to, I agree with everything he said about micromobility, except for if only in good weather, because we have to know that, you know, in Copenhagen or Amsterdam, there's some bad, sleety, cold, dark, wet commutes. I was talking to a bike shop here that's been leasing out e-bikes, and they said something interesting is that people certainly do start in fair weather, but then they love the autonomy and nimbleness of it, and the idea of getting back into a car that they have to park or even subway, that with lots of people, they find there's a large percentage that continue once you've experienced that nimbleness and autonomy.
I find it interesting, and just in terms of the weather thing, I find interesting that one of the cities that has the most people riding bikes to work is Ottawa, Canada, which can't have good weather that much of the year. Mark, you were going to say something?
Yeah, and I think the difference is when you are talking to somebody who owns an electric bike, like the company that would be leasing it, those people have made a commitment to biking. So I have an e-bike. I commute every day on it, rain or shine. My observation is that the people that are using the shared bikes that are all throughout the city, those racks are empty on the nice days and they're completely full. So that when you have a choice of, hey, it's a marginal cost to take a shared bike. Yeah, today I think I'll take an Uber or I'll use my vehicle. So even in San Francisco, it's the folks that haven't committed to it wholeheartedly in the sharing sense, they're the ones that find they can switch to different transportation types more easily.
Aaron, has bike sharing and scooter sharing, it's my impression, it's pretty well advanced in Europe right now.
It's really taken off, and there's a general active travel boom that we have been observing over the past years. Of course, active travel, that's also what we should be looking at. Being on a bike, being on an e-bike is more active than being on an e-scooter, which is not particularly active. It's better to be on an e-scooter than to be on a car, but still it's not the same, I would say, as cycling and walking. So there we also make a distinction, and that's also where we see that our cities are trying to regulate micromobility in a way that we also don't come up with a unwanted modal shift. What we don't want to see happening is to have pedestrians and cyclists move on to e-scooters. What we want to see is get those car drivers out of their cars and move them onto e-scooters. So it's also a matter of trying to influence that modal shift in the right direction. And sometimes we see forces working against us, in the sense that when you ask for a walking route, for example, on Google Maps, it's trying to nudge you towards an e-scooter. It's like the monetization of walking, where commercial revenue is predominant instead of sustainability. And those are market forces that we need to try to regulate from a city perspective in terms of the policy goals that we're trying to achieve. But in general, bike sharing, micromobility is equally booming in Europe. Yes, absolutely.
And
Europe also, I was just going to say that Europe also has ride sharing between countries, which is something we don't really. So the U.S. is not really set up for that, but it's quite far advanced in Europe. You can share rides from England to France, or from France to Belgium, or whatever.
Jim, just to jump in on the other point, I think what's really important is to have an integrated approach to the transport in a city. So when we think about cycling, we've got to think about cycling parking near stations, the cycling infrastructure. So if we're genuinely going to drive the behavior change, we need to make sure that we have an integrated approach to micromobility with a wider transport system. And I think the second point is, as we come out of the pandemic, we need to build public confidence, in particular around using public transport. And we can't have a car-based recovery. So again, we need to think about answering a question on what does good look like in 5 years. We need to make sure there's confidence in public transport usage.
Are you seeing that returning? Is the use of public transit up in London?
Yeah, so certainly, I saw some figures last week where it was around 70-80% at the pre-pandemic levels. But we're also seeing a shift now in terms of when people are using public transport. So on Mondays and Fridays, perhaps the numbers aren't as high as they were. We're seeing the peak plateauing out a little bit more. But interestingly, on the weekends, we're seeing higher levels of usage relatively to other days. So, and obviously Tuesday to Thursday, we are seeing strong usage. So the patterns have changed somewhat to what they were pre-pandemic.
It's interesting to reflect on how often in transportation we want to really focus on meeting peak commuting demand. And with the pandemic, we have, of course, much more work from home, which has transformed how people are using public transportation. And we know that commute trips are only 20% of all trips, yet there's this incredible focus. So it's interesting and an opportunity for us to focus, as you talked about, I'd say not only an integrated approach, but a holistic approach, that we really want to talk about all of the trips. And so when we think about that 5-year game plan, and yeah, I'd love everyone to be having, every urban place to be having 80% of trips being done by non-car modes and other modes. I want to throw in, I just read this report out of Portland, which was surprising to me, that said that e-bikes were covering for 68% of car trips in these places where they had surveyed, which was shocking because a lot of those, that was US research. So it really does feel like, as we've talked about, that e-bikes are game changing and can switch people out of using their cars.
Now, we have unexpected events can cause fairly large effects in the marketplace. And we've seen how COVID does that, and we've just been discussing that. Ukraine also has had a significant effect by raising gas prices around the world. And currently, we're looking at like $5 a gallon gasoline in the United States, which is not high by European standards, but it's very high by American standards. I'm curious, and I've seen that because of high gas prices, the number of people going online and looking for their options and buying an electric car has gone like 500% up. So that was something you could have not foretold, but it is definitely happening. And unfortunately, Americans have tended to go back to their big gas guzzlers when gas prices ease. But I wanted to pivot to talking about electric cars a little bit, because in Norway, we have the world's best subsidies for EVs. And the result that it's actually achieved a tipping point where it's more electric cars are sold there than any other form. So I want to pose to the panel the question is that a good idea? That should the world be subsidizing electric cars to the same level as Norway is doing it? Because it seems to have worked as a strategy. Robin, you want to start with that?
Absolutely, with delight. No, not a great strategy. The people who buy new cars, and this is true in Europe as in the US, are predominantly older than the age of 50 who get to buy a new car, and are homeowners, and are the wealthiest among us. And so if we think about this transitional path and what we want the future to look like, I would love us to be subsidizing electric bikes for those with lowest income, and incentivizing it with great infrastructure for the rest of us. And I think we would see a much larger and more important transformation. And if we think about Norway, they have great biking infrastructure, and also in theory is trying to get its cars out of its cities. So I think so they substituted for cars, but cars are still causing congestion, inequality, unequal access, and inactivity and poor health. So I feel like, no, let's not. I don't want to see another 25 years of that car stock to be subsidized. I'd like to see us subsidizing better quality alternatives and integration.
Karen, Norway is in your purview. I would think. What do you think of the Norway's approach? And certainly when you visit Norway, you see Teslas used as taxis and a very widespread adoption of EVs, and it's a large percentage of the new cars bought.
Yeah, electrification is a bit too much seen as a holy grail at the moment. We also see it in the climate talks on the global level around the COP, that it seems to be the number one solution that is going to get us to reach our ambitions. And I fully agree with Robin that actually the number one thing is modal shift away from the private car. Just replacing the current cars with electric ones is not going to help us. Having said that, we do see that many of our cities are playing an active role in making sure that those cars that will remain, and we will always have them, will be electric indeed. So it is good to have incentives to some extent, but there are other modes that need to be incentivized even more. And what we really need to do if we want to move forward, and if we really want to have this radical change, is finally internalize the external cost of polluting car traffic to society, because we're still heavily subsidizing the polluting car as well. And that's the problem. Only when people will start feeling it in their wallets, like they are doing now because of the war, they will start to seriously consider alternatives. And we need to move away also from the false narrative that any pricing measures is hitting those which are already vulnerable. It's not true, because those people who are the most vulnerable are those which are exposed the most to air pollution, to noise pollution, and very often don't even own a car. So we need political leadership to make sure that we introduce unpopular pricing measures, bring out the sticks as well. And that's exactly also what London has been doing. And I think that's really needed to make that radical transformation.
I think we have some agreement on the panel here on this question, because Rikesh, I know your goal is to get people out of cars also and into transit. So you would agree with what Karen and Robin are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about the trip purpose, it could either be a Londoner making the trip or someone coming into London, or it could be a freight trip. So what we need to think about is what's the trip purpose, and then if we think about public transport, how do we move to zero emissions on public transport? So thinking about electrifying the bus network, and that is not just the bus itself, but also how do you do the civil engineering to make the garages fully electric. And then I think the second question is, if there's 20% in our case of private cars in our city, or private trips, car-related trips being made in our city, how do we optimize that so we're getting best value? And those should be zero emissions, and making sure that the freight vehicles are packed, and making sure that if someone does need to make that trip, they really need to make that trip rather than using public transport or other forms of active travel.
Mark, I think you want to get people out of cars too, right? Or at least privately owned ones.
Indeed, when we look at the gas price situation, which is pushing to one vector, but the implications of COVID combined with the two of those mean that we have an opportunity to make some changes in how people are compensated. In Europe, the company car is a birthright. And seeing the fact that many of these workers are now working 2 days a week in the office means that the company car that prior to that, 5 days a week was used to get them to the office, and maybe 2 days a week they'd use it for the weekend. Now it's only being used 2 days a week for work. And so we're discovering that our customers that are in the fleet business, like Arval, are getting lots and lots of requests for mobility budgets now, because the workers are saying, this car is just sitting around. I'm taking shared mobility, I'm taking public transit, I'm renting these e-bikes, and this is an expense that I'd rather have you pay for. And shared mobility is one that's actually much easier to do with electrification, because these things oftentimes have somebody who's responsible for keeping them charged. The bike systems that are shared have, plugs and docks. The vehicles, especially with the range now getting 250 or 300 miles, means that these vehicles are able to be used in a shared environment in cities for many, many days before they need to be brought to a charger. Every 3 days is about how often vehicles should be cleaned if they're being used 6 to 10 times a day. So it's really the confluence of these things. But if the government still provides incentives for the subsidies for company cars, for instance, those are the kinds of things that are going to need to change so that we can move away from private vehicle ownership.
People
let me add just one sentence to that, because I should have mentioned it sooner. And what Mark said was so correct. And just starting with the beginning of that conversation about Norway, what should be subsidized and we should have large amounts of money for is to convert intensively used vehicles that drive the largest distances should be the ones that are the first ones to electrify. So that would include all of public transportation, that would include delivery vehicles, and that would include all the shared vehicles. And Mark just explained why shared electric fleets make so much sense for electric ownership. So that's if governments insist on spending money on subsidizing large electric vehicles, they should be doing it for all of those intensively used ones first, so they get more CO2 reduction bang for their output.
Well, of course, Robin, we do have a technological challenge that probably the vehicles that are on the road the most are long distance trucks, and they're the hardest to electrify.
I think great. This is an urban panel.
True. I think we've made progress with school buses. I think they are ideal electric vehicles. I'm actually working in my own community to try to get our fleet converted to electric, and we definitely do not want our kids breathing in diesel smoke, which is what happens now. But I see your point, Robin. Yes, Rikesh.
Just one point, which is going back to the subsidy. So in London, anyone in full-time education has free travel on public transport. So immediately we're seeing a behavior shift there where we're making public transport more attractive. So I think firstly,
is that new? Is that a new?
No, it's been around for several years. But what we're seeing there is not only are the young children at a very early age getting familiar with public transport, so they become public transport users of the future, but it means their parents are also now using public transport to drop them to school or letting them go by public transport rather than using the private car. So I think there are some policy decisions that also help when it comes to incentivization.
We've had that in intermittently in the United States. Portland, Oregon had a fareless square around the urban center there, but as far as I know, they eventually abandoned that for budgetary reasons. But it was certainly an innovative thing. And other cities, Santa Monica tried it with a bus system. Let me just, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about the future of urban mobility and innovation in transport with the panelist Rikesh Shah, who's head of commercial innovation for Transport for London, Robin Chase, co-founder of Zipcar and the New Urban Mobility Alliance, Mark Thomas, who's vice president, marketing and alliances at Ridecell, and Karen Vancluysen, who's Secretary General at POLIS. So it does seem we're making a lot of progress, but are we making enough progress? Just last night, I was interviewing a Yale professor who's got a new book out on climate solutions, and he thinks we're just not moving fast enough, and we got to sort of pivot to carbon capture and other things like that. Are we moving fast enough? I think probably we're all going to agree no, I would think. Mark, you want to start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of our customers are customers that are interested and have shared vehicles similar to the Zipcar model. And they're stymied because in every city that they're intending to expand, they have to go petition. Many of these cities don't allow for free-floating style car sharing. The drivers see a shared vehicle and think, hey, that's where I normally park. So the cities are beholden to the affluent people who want convenient parking and think that these shared vehicles aren't supporting their personal objectives. So we need actually something like state regulations or even federal regulations that require a certain percentage of licensed vehicles in a city to be shared and make it painful for the cities themselves to not do this. Also to have the same permit process that you apply for, maybe if that's at a state level, then you can expand to all the cities in a state much more easily. Here we've got companies that are desperately looking to expand, and it's taking them years to get into certain markets, and that just shouldn't be the case.
Have we actually seen communities that have enacted regulations like that, saying the percentage of the fleet has to be shared? Or is that sort of more a aspire?
I think that's an aspirational goal, and not at the community level, but at the state or even federal level, to incentivize the locals who are like, hey, it's a state rule. Sorry, I realize you're losing some of your dedicated parking, but these will primarily be electric vehicles now, which again is a tipping point, because a 250-mile range vehicle is much easier to put into service than a few years ago when they were only half that.
I've seen innovation like communities requiring that new housing be equipped with EV charging, or just the wiring for EV charging, that kind of thing. We're seeing regulations like that slowly creep up, but
Jim, as you say that, so
San Francisco, if you're near a public transit corridor, it's now illegal to build housing units that have parking, because the goal is to make it as uncomfortable as possible, which is all, then of course people still own their cars, and it floods the neighborhood streets with people vying for those spots. But yeah, if there were dedicated parking spots for shared vehicles in those that had charging stations, that would go a long way. Sorry,
Robin, jump in.
I want to say that the in Boston and in some cities, they have let building developers buy out of parking spaces by putting in shared parking spots. But I think we should be going to, your point is so exact, that it's a street by street fight to get in parking spaces for any shared vehicles. And ideally, we should have it at a higher government level. I want to comment that in addition to, in many places in Europe, and definitely in the Netherlands, you're required to build a bike parking space per unit. But Rikesh, I'm interested in hearing from you. London, I thought, had some overarching rule that let you make those turn car space into bike space without having to do a street by street fight. What was that rule?
I'm not sure actually, Robin, to be honest.
I thought just outside the TfL's offices even is a bike, like one half of the road is for bikes, and I think it was.
Okay, you're talking about segregated cycle super highways. Is that right?
Also, and so was there a larger rule that enabled you to do that without car owners able to argue every single block?
Yeah, so I think, London's roads, the makeup is there are 33 highways agencies in London. So we do have to work with the relevant highways agencies as you're putting a cycle lane through. But it requires, Karen touched on this earlier, it requires that political leadership and alignment. Say cycling is the right mode of transport, and we will make land available. And that's a difficult decision, because you're taking some land space away from the cars, who in many aspects are not necessarily happy about this. But that, as I say, comes back to the strong political leadership to say, if we're putting the cycle lane through, which connects different corridors in London, make some bold decisions.
The good thing
Karen,
about
Karen, can I just focus you in this particular area? I believe Europe has something like 100 cities that are car-free in the central downtown zone. Is that well received, and is it expanding?
Yeah, so as Rikesh said, you have to push through, and we have also in the meantime collected sufficient proof to say that pedestrianization is not bad for local business, for example, and that once it's in place, that people respond positively to it. But sometimes you need to convince them and win their hearts and minds first. And in that sense, COVID has been an eye-opener, because because of these temporary measures that were introduced, people could really experience in real life what it feels like to have a different city with more space for cycling and walking. And that makes it easier now as well to make those measures permanent. And we see that those cities which had very good sustainable urban mobility plans in place with long-term visions in terms of giving the streets back to the people have performed particularly well, and also are more successful in making these measures now permanent. So they have put a trend that was in the pipeline on a fast track and accelerated that trend, because there's no way that we can go back. We are really massively respacing in Europe, even though there is always opposition that you have to deal with. And coming back to your question on, are we fast enough? We have the 100 climate neutral cities mission, as we call it in Europe, that's been launched by the European Commission. And this initiative has just selected 100 cities that commit to climate neutrality by 2030. So not just from a transport perspective, but from a climate perspective overall. 2030 is tomorrow. So if we're not going to accelerate now, then when are we? We have set ambitious goals and targets that we need to reach on the European level. So now is really the time to accelerate and to start moving faster, because COVID might have been very tangible, but if you look at the numbers when it comes to climate change, when it comes to safety and the need to move towards vision zero, when it comes to air pollution, we are killing millions of people in those crises as well, even though we sometimes tend to treat it as collateral damage, and clearly we need to move away from that.
And Jim, just building on Karen's point, I think any city should have a healthier city as a core transport objective. And that could be in the areas of respiratory diseases, being active and obesity, type 2 diabetes, and road safety. You know, as transport agencies, we have a big responsibility around creating a healthier city. And I think every city should be considering that.
Let me just mention the delivery aspect of cities. I think I read that New York has something like 1 million vehicles entering it every day. We really could do something to reduce that. And some of these are very large trucks that are doing deliveries. And we have the concept of last mile delivery, which can be shunted off to smaller electric vehicles. People have even talked about drones for that purpose for the last mile. And I'm seeing companies starting up with this focus. Are we making progress there? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Well, we have a very active city logistics urban freight working group within POLIS, and we're looking at all kinds of solutions where we need to partner really with the industry, because this is a typical example of where you need that public-private sector collaboration. The cargo bikes are getting more and more popular to cover that last urban mile also for city logistics. At the same time, we've seen this explosion of e-commerce, which is leading to a further increase of wide vans in the city and further, not just big trucks, but also many smaller vehicles creating negative externalities. And so we're also looking at how to bundle goods as much as we can. So all kinds of consolidation approaches are being tested as well and piloted in cities. When it comes to drones, this is still very much in the pilot stage, and there are also question marks as to how energy efficient actually drones would be in the end. But city logistics are more and more also in the focus, and cities are also developing dedicated sustainable urban logistics plans now to really deal with the transport of goods next to the transport of people in their localities.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, and I agree with Karen about collaboration. You know, traditionally the cities and the private sector have been quite apart, and we've got to collaborate here and say, what does good look like? And something we tried in London was we ran a program called Freight Lab, which is still live now. And the idea there was, how do we partner with some of the largest carriers in our city to look for innovative solutions? And how do we go out with some of the smaller innovators out there who might be able to come up with some innovative ideas? So Freight Lab has been running for a while, and we've had a wide range of ideas that have come through, from micro consolidation to one particular company that's found a new compound where, when you've got electric vehicles, so you may reduce the emissions from the tailpipe, but you may still create additional friction from the brake pads. or they've just created a new compound that doesn't pollute. So we're testing that out with some of our larger carriers in our city. And there's a series of other innovative solutions. So I think we genuinely have to trial and experiment together to see what some of the new innovative technologies can do. And if they're successful, how do you scale them in cities like London?
Can I add just a few things to that? One day I was thinking about this consolidation of freight problem and delivery to homes. And I thought, that's a perfect startup. And then I realized that's what the post office does. The post office is a consolidator. And yet we now have this, so I would love to see some additional surcharges being put on delivery, personal delivery that does not use the post office as a consolidator. But Karen raised something else that's actually my horror, which is drone delivery in cities on either sidewalks or in the air. And just as we now, 100 years later, after cars were introduced, appreciate that they have incredible negative externalities and have consumed public commons in a way that was underappreciated, public air, public noise, public fatalities, public physical spaces and rights of way. Drones in cities delivering toilet paper or toothpaste to me because I'm too lazy to walk 3 blocks is my complete horror. And so just as we've talked about, what are the negative externalities and charges, I would love cities to put a price on the sky and the quietness and privacy of the sky. And that in Boston, we have drone delivery using organs between one organ transplant, between a hospital and another. They could absorb the appropriate tax, which would be how many people do you fly over when you're making your trajectory within 100 yards. And so if you had such a tax, flying in places where there's no humans and low infrastructure, it makes sense. But flying over and disturbing hundreds of thousands of residents every day, multiple times, seems to me should become with a hefty tax to preserve that public good.
I never liked drones much either. So let me just, we only have like 3 more minutes. I just want to go around the panel and ask very quickly, give us a fast answer. And are you optimistic that we're going to put the gas guzzling automobile to bed and make a transition to a more sustainable urban transportation infrastructure? Karen, you must just give us a quick answer on that. You're optimistic?
Yes, I choose to be optimistic, and I've seen a lot of encouraging things happening over the past years in our cities. We had a great meeting of political leaders just 2 months ago, and if you see their commitment, including the political deputy mayor for transport from London, if you see their commitment and their understanding of the challenges ahead of us, yes, I'm optimistic.
Robin?
I'm always a pessimist, except I'm an optimistic pessimist. In the US right now, there are more units of electric bikes being imported than electric cars. And so we're seeing higher sales of electric micromobility. So I feel like it's within our grasp to make that transition, but we definitely need more champions on the ground fighting hard. And it's a city by city, block by block fight.
Wow. Rikesh, 15 seconds on this.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. So I set out that 80% target earlier. And, we've had record numbers of users on our Santander scheme. We've got more cycle lanes than we've had in the past. We've just introduced the Elizabeth line. So I'm really positive that, people will move to sustainable forms of transport and make our cities better.
Finally, Mark, we have like 1 minute left.
I'm optimistic because there is a generational change coming, where vehicles are not seen as freedom, they're seen as an obligation. And freedom is the ability to get in an Uber and just go where you're going, not worry about parking, not spend your weekend polishing the vehicle. So yeah, my kids don't want a car, don't need a car, but in lots of parts of America, you try to take somebody's truck away from them and they're going to fight you tooth and nail. It's like armed control. So yes, we will eventually outgrow vehicles, but maybe not as quickly as we'd like.
I want to thank my panelists, Rikesh Shah, Robin Chase, Mark Thomas, Karen Vancluysen. Great panel, very thought-provoking. Thank you for the Global Impact Forum.